Most enclosed mall deals look good on paper. The pro forma is clean, the occupancy number looks solid, the cap rate seems attractive, the story usually makes sense. But in mall investing, headline numbers can be misleading. A mall can show strong occupancy and still have tenants that can't afford to stay. It can show positive NOI while ignoring millions in deferred maintenance. It can look stable today while a major lease rollover is about to reset the income stream. So when we review mall financials, we're not just asking, does this deal look good? We're asking, does the mall actually work? In this video, we'll walk through the key metrics that we use to answer that question. Enclosed malls are different from most other real estate assets because the financials are highly connected. Tenant sales affect rent affordability. Anchor stores affect foot traffic. Traffic affects inline sales. Inline sales affect renewal probability. Capital spending affects tenant confidence. And tenant confidence affects future NOI. That's why we don't rely on one number. Occupancy alone is not enough. Cap rate alone is not enough. Projected NOI alone is definitely not enough. We look at the system behind the numbers. The first metric we look at is occupancy cost ratio. That's the tenant's total cost of being in the mall divided by the tenant's gross sales. Total costs include base rent, CAM, taxes, insurance, marketing contributions. In plain English, this tells us whether the tenant can afford to stay. Healthy occupancy cost ratios usually are from 8 to 15%, depending upon the tenant type. For example, food and beverage tenants usually need to stay lower because their margins are a little tighter. Specialty apparel often works best around 10 to 14%. Jewelry and accessories can sometimes handle more because their margins are higher. Service tenants can be sticky, but only if costs stay predictable. This matters even more in enclosed malls because CAM is expensive. A strip center might pay $3 to $5 triple net. In an enclosed mall, the tenant might pay $8 to $15 all in or even more because of climate-controlled common areas, elevators, escalators, security, restrooms, lighting, and interior maintenance. Here's the red flag. A pro forma that increases rent 3% each year, but does not model tenant sales growth, that means that the rent's occupancy cost ratio gets worse every year. Eventually, the rent may look good to the landlord, but stop working for the tenant. And if it doesn't work for the tenant, it won't work for the mall. The next metric is sales per square foot. If occupancy cost ratio tells us how heavy the rent burden is, sales per square foot tells us how strong the tenant's business is. For Class B enclosed malls and tertiary markets, inline sales often fall from around $250 to $400 per square foot, depending upon tenant mix and market strength. That relationship matters. A tenant doing $380 per square foot has more room to handle these triple nets than a tenant doing $250 a square foot. So we don't just look at average sales, we look at the cushion. If most tenants are doing $250 a square foot and paying $35 per square foot in total occupancy, in terms of total occupancy costs, that's a 14% occupancy cost ratio. On paper, it may still look acceptable, but there's very little room for a bad quarter, very little room for a new competitor, a CAM increase, or a slowdown in the local economy. One of the most misunderstood parts of mall financials is the difference between anchor rent and inline rent. Anchors usually pay much less. A department store may pay $3 to $8 per square foot per year, while inline tenants may pay $20 to $45 per square foot per year or more. That spread's normal. Anchors are not there to drive rent growth. They're there to drive traffic. In a typical enclosed mall, anchors may occupy 50 to 60% of the gross leasable area, but contribute only 15 or 20% of the total base rent. That's not automatically a problem. It becomes a problem when anchor leases are expiring soon and the pro forma assumes they simply renew with no disruption. If an anchor closes, the mall can lose traffic, inline sales can fall, co-tenancy clauses can be triggered. So the question is not just, who are the anchors? The better question is, What happens to the rent roll if one of them leaves? Now, let's look at tenant retention. A healthy enclosed mall should retain roughly 70 to 80% of tenants at lease expiration. Below 65%, something's usually wrong. Maybe the sales are weak. Maybe occupancy costs, they're too high. Maybe the mall has not been maintained. Maybe tenants are staying only because they receive concessions. Retention matters because vacancy spreads differently in a mall. One dark storefront may not change much, but 3 or 4 dark storefronts in the same corridor can shift foot traffic. Customers avoid that wing. Remaining tenants lose sales. More tenants leave. That's why we also look at same-store NOI growth. For secondary and tertiary market malls, 2 to 4% annual same-store NOI growth can be solid. Flat NOI may be acceptable during repositioning, but negative NOI for more than 2 consecutive years is a warning sign. We want to see whether NOI is growing because the property is actually improving, not because the model assumes smooth renewals, low downtime, and minimal leasing costs. Capital expenditures are where many mall models get too optimistic. Enclosed malls are expensive to maintain. You've got roofs across massive footprints, HVAC for hundreds of thousands of square feet, parking lots, lighting, escalators, elevators, restrooms, flooring, signage, fire systems, and common areas. These are not optional expenses. So if a mall generates $5 million of NOI, that means $500,000 to $750,000 per year should be reserved for capex needs. Larger roof or HVAC projects can run $2 million or even $5 million. Now compare that to a pro forma that shows $100,000 of annual capex for a 700,000 square foot enclosed mall. That's not a real capex budget. It may make cash flow look better, but it does not reflect what the property actually needs. A mall can look profitable because maintenance has been deferred, but eventually the roof leaks, the HVAC fails, the parking lot deteriorates, or tenants start complaining. Deferred maintenance is not savings. It's a bill waiting to come due. Here are the pro forma traps we watch for. First, gross occupancy versus economic occupancy. A mall may report 90% occupancy, but some tenants may be in for free rent or percentage-only leases or behind on payments. We want to know how much contracted rent is actually being collected. Second, above market lease roll. If a large portion of leases expire soon and those tenants are paying above market rent, current income may not be durable. Third, lease rollover concentration. We're generally comfortable with 10 to 15% of GLA rolling in a year. Above 20%, it becomes a real concentration risk. Above 25%, it can become a crisis year if the mall's not prepared. Fourth, capex that does not match the building condition. If the property condition assessment says the mall needs $3 million of work and the model budget's $500,000, the returns are overstated. A good pro forma should survive friction, should survive tenant turnover, downtime, free rent, TI allowance, CAM pressure, capital repairs, etc. If the deal only works when everything goes right, it probably does not work. The key to reading mall financials is understanding that no metric works alone. High occupancy does not matter if tenants are not paying. Strong sales do not matter if retention is weak. Low capex does not matter if the building has been ignored. Anchor traffic does not matter if the anchor is about to leave. When we underwrite a mall, we look at the full system. What are the tenants paying? What are they selling? Are they renewing? What leases are rolling? What capital does the building need? And is NOI durable or just polished for the pro forma? That's the difference between reading a spreadsheet and understanding a mall.